Thank you very much. Yes, that introduction is correct, and I'll add that we have a degree in a master's of science in community development in our department, and so that's been a big part of my world. It's an online master's degree and online graduate certificate through the Great Plains IDEA, and I'm going to present today a topic that's it's theoretical. It's probably a little controversial, perhaps, in a way that my co-authors and I have been having some fun with it and thinking through it and thinking through the ideas. So going back to what was said about the experts in the room, if you disagree, please tell me why, because this is an ongoing conversation that we're having a good time exploring. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got there. Can everyone see the PowerPoint slide? Okay, so the name of the presentation is Local Washing in Communities. It's a collaboration between myself, Craig Talmadge, and Corey Wright. And we have started to dig into this idea based on a discussion that took place about a year ago. And to tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to first introduce to some critical perspectives on local entrepreneurship. Co-author Craig Talmadge, that is his specialization. We're going to look at the nuancing local enterprise, some narratives of localism that we have been educated on through our careers and our education, and then framing local enterprise behavior, and then ending with testing the model, which hopefully is an opportunity to generate some dialogue and discussion. My co-author Craig, as you can see, who's cited on several of these articles here, really does bring the background and could do a better job explaining about the critical perspectives on local entrepreneurship. But I wanted to put these out there for you to write down or to look up further. But there's a growing body of literature about the dark side of community development. And essentially, to sum that up, is there's a saying that you may have heard, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, meaning just because something is done with the best intentions and done in a benevolent way can in fact, at times foster unintended negative outcomes and consequences. And so there's a growing body of literature out there looking at this. Nuancing local enterprise. Okay, so the idea here is that in my background in planning and education, and perhaps yours, but in the US, that we have been taught for decades at this point that essentially local is better. Local is preferred over international conglomerates or corporations or outside entities that come in that may be extractors from a community as opposed to grassroots development. And this is and that full disclosure, that's what brought me into community development, is the idea of Main Street development, localism on Main Street. How do we keep place-based community ownership where money is spent and stays and regenerated through a community, right? But started to teasing through this conversation the idea that with anything, absolutes are not absolute. And so there may be reasons and instances where, and I'm not, this is not meant to be anti-local by any means, but it is meant to say that there are instances where local could be more positive or negative. And there are scales where outside institutions can be more positive and negative. An example of nuancing local enterprise and the kind of the dark side of localism. Well, local shops. I think, going back to the previous picture, when we think of local shops, we think of kind of perhaps a restaurant or a cafe or something adding a benefit to the quality of life of the community, right? Well, vape shops, smoke tobacco shops, these are local businesses as well, right? And perhaps they're not benefiting the community from a health standpoint if they're selling a product that perhaps is bad for you. This idea of the hometown advantage and the idea of this kind of glorification of localism and the idea of the local bakery or the local pastry shop is quite romanticized in text and in movies and everywhere we look. The idea of this, down on Main Street, and it's certainly something that I prefer as a consumer going out and shopping for the most part. But I want to tell a story and an anecdote of kind of where this model that I'm going to display or show is coming from. A couple of years ago, my son, who's 6 now, was learning to ride a bike. And when he was learning to ride a bike, he got out his older brother's old bike that had been sitting in a storage shed for several years. And so it had a busted wheel. And so I took the son and the busted wheel up down to our Main Street here in the town that I live in. And we went into the Specialized bike store. And it was go back a little further, it was a bike that I had bought for his older brother about 5 years earlier at a garage sale. So it was probably 10, 15 years old when I bought it. So this is not a fancy bike. This is probably the least expensive bike that you could possibly buy a child. And went into the local bike shop and they wanted to fix the tire and just kind of had a real sort of pushback or an attitude of, why would I want to fix this tire on this wheel on this, trash bike, on this bike that wasn't worth very much. I should buy a new bike. And, don't waste their time essentially. And, why wasn't this bike, it was not a nice bike. It was not, he wasn't going to win the Tour de France on this bike. But nor was that the intention. And it was really kind of a snobby attitude that I was not up to speed on the best bikes for a 3-year-old. So we went around the corner to a big box store, a place where a corporation of a sports store that had moved in, and actually it had moved in about 10 years earlier. And when it moved in, the local bike store, along with a lot of the other local businesses on Main Street, actually vocalized and organized to say, don't let this big box store move into the neighborhood. This is going to distract from the community, distract from the quality of life, distract from the local services. And the store still went in. But anyway, I went into the local store and I was went into the little bike section in the back. And I said, can you fix this person's bike? And he said, sure, if you have 10 minutes and $7, I can fix your bike. And so we sat there and he fixed the tire and we were on our way. And my son was very happy and I was very happy because I didn't spend that much time or money. I didn't have to buy a new bike. And we went off and learned to ride the bike. Fast forward. And I noticed that as my kids were out there playing football and playing different sports and athletics throughout the community, almost every single community event was being sponsored by this big box store. It was on the back of shirts. It was on the back of scoreboards. They were pumping a lot of money into youth sports and recreation and programming in our communities. And in a way that across the community, whether you shop there or not, the youth of the community were benefiting from recreation because of the money that this big box store was able to put back into the community and did put back in the community. And looking into it further, their philanthropic model is designed to do that. And they do that in every community that they're located in. Looking into the bike store downtown, the local bike store that didn't want the big box to come in and who didn't want to waste their time fixing my cheap bike, they don't put the money into the youth sports. They don't put the money in the community. And I'm not saying that they should. Perhaps the reason they don't do that is because they don't have the money to put it in where the big box store does. But just the idea that one is putting money in the community, one is not. One is providing a cheap, friendly service, and one is not, from a personal, anecdotal perspective, kind of got me thinking, okay, we've spent the entire, I have a lot of books up there on my shelf, if I were to pan this camera, that talks about why the big box store is evil and why the local store is the ideal. But perhaps there's more to that story that we could start to unpack. And so we started to put together this model that, again, this is by no means, and clear by the model. If you take and you look through it and you read it, and I'm going to leave it up for a minute so you can, by no means is this saying that the outside store is better than the local store. What this is saying is there is a sliding scale and there is gray area in all, and it is not an absolute. And why this is important from a community development perspective and a community perspective is the idea that because of this romanticized narrative that local is always better, I have seen time and time again where rules get bent for the local in the name of localism, right? So what we've done is we've created this sort of spectrum. We have local, regional, and outsider. Within that, you have sharer, saver, and extractor. Let me give you another example of a local extractor. Well, we have, I live and I work in a town that is predominantly exists because there's a university here. It's a university town. So there's a lot of college age students. It brings people, there's a very transient population because people come here, they go to school for 4 or 5 years and then they move on. And so there's not that sort of investment. So one of the local industries that has become sort of profitable in my community is being what they call a local slumlord, essentially buying up these houses downtown that used to be sort of larger homes and then converting them into like 4 or 5 different individual units, which in itself is fine, except for once that's done, because of the market, a lot of the local landlords that practice this sort of student slumlord practice don't ever put a dime of maintenance or investment back into that property. And there is issues there's electrical issues, which are fire hazards. There's mold issues, which is health hazard. There's oftentimes exposed lead paint and use of asbestos, which is health hazard. And the local landlord industry has gotten so powerful and so organized in its own self that several years ago, there was a movement to put in rental inspection so that the community could go in and inspect local properties to make sure that essentially it was not unhealthy for a human being to live there. And the local landlord coalition organized and lobbied the local board to not pass that. And it didn't pass because they had the political capital to shut that down. That's an example of what would be a local extractor. So when they live here in the community, they make their money in the community and they spend their money in the community. But are they a positive force in community development? I would argue they are not. And then moving across kind of up diagonal, you have the outside sharer. And that's the example of the big box sports store where the son went to go buy. The owner does not live in this region, but the business does contribute to the community. They put multiple dollars back in the community for youth sports that I know I and many others get to enjoy with our families. So they're minimal to no drain on the local resources because they are paying their taxes and they're putting money back in. So this is the idea here. Is that there's not it's not a A or B, it's not a binary, it's a scale, but it does kind of go in opposite of what we've talked about, at least in my personal education and journals and the books that I've read for many times over, and that's where I'll leave it. Our next step in this process is testing the model. Our third co-author is a city planner for a local community nearby, where we're going to go out and inventory different community businesses and look at how the matrix can be filled in. And that's where I will stop.
Okay, thank you, Houston. Thank you for your presentation. As you promised us, it's a little bit controversial, maybe, yes, and we will discuss it later. I think that our participants will have questions, maybe we will have some other opinions, and that's great. That's great. Thank you. And now I want to introduce our second presenter. We will watch all three presentations and then we will open the discussion. So our second presenter is from Croatia. Anna is an associate professor and the experienced researcher and the expert in the deprived communities of Croatia. Currently, Anna Opacic, she's engaged into considering community revitalization after major disasters. So Anna, the floor is to you and your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction. So good afternoon to you all, or wherever you are, another part of the day, and I'm glad to share some perspectives with you here again this year regarding Croatian Banovina region, that is kind of, let's say, an archetype of a deprived community. Just maybe also give you an idea what the presentation will be about. I will make some very short introduction to deprived communities and theory of vicious cycle of community deprivation, and then put it in the context of Banovina region and consider it how the power that is in, let's say, the central concept in the title can be used, how now is used against the community, but how can it and should be used for the community to prevent or stop the vicious cycle of community deprivation. So just discussing the term the deprived, disadvantaged, or whatever you would call them, communities throughout the world. I know it doesn't matter which term I use, people are always angry about, don't talk about deprived, don't talk about disadvantaged, don't talk about vulnerable, but the fact is that it's a very global social problem, and that at least we know for sure that at least 1.2 billion people live in such communities, regardless of its features. So if we go from deprived urban communities like slums, favelas, ghettos, deprived neighborhoods in UK, through areas with high concentration of poverty, such as in USA, low-income communities, poor areas in China, impoverished area, or if we go to European Union, we will come across the term less favored areas, or in Australia, Canada, remote areas, so with communities of decreased development prospects. And finally, there are like a fourth group of these kind of communities, communities at risk that can be vulnerable due to their exposure to ecological hazards, or marginalized if they are mostly consisted of high concentration of some ethnic, religious minorities. So it doesn't matter what we speak about the communities that are, let's say, in the overall concept deprived, underprivileged, and they do really represent a big social problem at the global scale. So just maybe some basic questions about when let's say, my entire academic and practical career, I was actually dealing with this kind of communities at of course, in my national context, but also, let's say, in comparative international context. And usually there are three questions that people raise about these communities. So do they exist in developed countries? And of course, the answer is yes, they do. Is development and underdevelopment part of the same continuum? continuum? And the answer is no, because research shows that actually community has bigger effect on individual well-being if it's a bad community. So if you live in a fluent community, then it means that your individual characteristics make, let's say, significant impact on your well-being than the community as a surrounding. So it does matter, especially if you live, let's say, in adverse or deprived community. And the third question regarding deprived communities is, are deprived communities just an aggregation of people that are at risk of poverty? And the answer is no, they are much more than that. So it's not just an aggregated individual characteristics, but deprived communities face some community processes that work against their development. And they are, of course, they have some structural features that define them, that they are at risk or underdeveloped. So just to conclude, if what are we talking about when we say deprived community, then we talk about areas, neighborhoods, or communities that have high concentration of people at risk of poverty, that have unfavorable development outcomes compared to their surrounding, and they have significant structural barriers with exposure to certain risk. So, and doing, let's say, a very extensive literature review on an international level, I could notice that there is some kind of, let's say, same mechanisms that is going on that I somehow call the vicious cycle of community deprivation, that in short looks like this. It's very short. So everything, we can take the structural factors as the beginning of the process, and it doesn't matter are these factors good or bad, but they have significant impact on the community development. So they can be bad, of course, like wars, ecological catastrophes, but they can also be good, let's say, like these incremental social changes going through, let's say, I know we have many of these changes that happened actually after the end of socialist period, and now maybe if we talk about green transition, digital transition, these are all important structural factors. But what is important is not these factors themselves. It is important that if there is a community that is somehow much more exposed to these factors or cannot deal with the changes adequately, it actually becomes vulnerable with different practices in exercising power, exploitation, stigmatization, and unequal opportunities. So we come across these examples across the world, that there is something that attracts bad practices against deprived communities all over the world. And I found also many of these examples in our Croatian region, and of course, throughout the literature, really from USA to Australia, across the globe. And then, of course, what happens inside the community also matters in this cycle of deprivation. So it is actually, the question is how they deal with their institutions, their capacity structures. Are they some archetypes? And usually they cherish, they nurture, let's say, kind of archetypes that always keeps them in a position of being less effective, less connected, with let's say, low level of community trust, connectedness, etc. And of course, they have difficulties to reach the resilience to oppose the new structural factors that would happen to them. And then we have actually something that makes this process even more difficult. It is the thing that when outside actors, when they realize what is going on in these levels above them, then they enter into the struggle for limited resources. Their community conflicts start to appear, clientelism, inequalities, and what is actually also one of the, let's say, logics in deprived communities, that inner inequalities are sometimes even higher than inequalities on a wider social level. So, and of course, the cycle, let's say, ends up with a self-stigmatization, with different practices of social disorganization, and the confirmation of the position of helplessness. So when I put this cycle in the context of one Croatian region called Banovina, that I was personally and professionally involved into, of course, all these boxes were filled with many factors that influenced its development. So just to give you maybe a short idea, this is the map of Croatia. Croatia has this about 1,000 kilometer long border with Bosnia and Herzegovina. So here would be Bosnia and Herzegovina, here would be Serbia, here would be Hungary, and here would be Slovenia, and then going to Italy. So these blue parts of Croatia are deprived parts of Croatia. So you see Eastern Croatia and the Dalmatian hinterlands. And these red parts would be, let's say, affluent parts, of course, the coast and the capital city and some areas in northern Croatia. And the area of Banovina that I'm talking about is actually here. It's, let's say, in the central Croatia at the border with Bosnia and Herzegovina. And just to give you an idea about its continuous underdevelopment is just the data from population census. So in 2021, this area had approximately more than 85,000 inhabitants, while in 1991, this area had 117, almost, let's say, 180,000 residents. So you see that there was a decrease in this 30 years for more than 53%, and it's really the region that is caught in the vicious cycle of community deprivation. So if we put this local context into the theoretical model, we get the following factors. So just to know some, starting from the structural point of view, this area, although it is in a very proximity of the capital city of Zagreb, it was usually and throughout its history very dependent on state interventionism. It was kind of an area called military frontier, and it was, of course, a result of a planned industrialization that happened in socialism. And then it was also exposed to Serbian occupation and was part of so-called, let's say, Republika Srpska Krajina. And what happened in the 95, there was actually a completely different demographic structure with the Serbian population leaving the community and Bosnian population settling in the community. During EU period, we noticed a really great immigration. So this is also one of the structural factors entering the European Union. And to finish with the structural factors, in 2020, this area was hit by devastating earthquake with, let's say, approximately 5.5 billion euros damage and affected almost 50,000 people living in this area. And what this area has witnessed, as I said, these are all structural factors that play against this area. But above this, we noticed many types of oppression happening from the outside of the community. So it was kind of stigmatized area, the platform for political rallies and populism based on its connection to the war. It was exploited. There are many practices of exploitation of local resources, mainly land, water, and forests that are sold below market prices. And now it's becoming a places where many hazard waste disposals are being built. For example, nuclear waste disposal, asbest, medicine waste disposal, radioactive. So all kinds of dangerous waste disposal are now settled in this area. And what happens inside, of course, there is low citizens' participation and trust. It is kind of disorganized community that's actually completely and substantially changed in 1995 due to these changes in population. But this fact was never acknowledged. That was the problem. And maybe compared to what some might assume, opposed to that, we actually don't have any kind of post-war conflicts in this area because the population doesn't know each other, but it's completely different than the situation before the 90s. Of course, institutions are disempowered in many aspects, and the municipalities are actually very fragmented. So you would have many municipalities, but actually this fragmentation serves only some political purposes. It doesn't have much sense in the field. So this is something that additionally disempowers the whole area. And then, of course, as a result of combining outside and inside processes, we have non-transparent institutions. It was impossible to get a secure job without political affiliation, corruption in local government, local sheriffs that occurred in this area. There was dualism between white-collar population and impoverished and indebted blue-collar population and farmers. And as a result, of course, and to end up the vicious cycle, we see again examples of self-stigmatization and stigmatization. The area is identified itself as a victim. You would see a very negligent environment that points to this kind of social disorganization and the position of helplessness in confirm and the orientation towards outside experts and authorities. So, of course, to conclude, how can we actually use this vicious cycle of deprivation to understand what can we make different about all these processes that are going on? And we noticed while I was a part of an expert that was called to propose a program for the 10-year revitalization of this area. And of course, there are many levels when we have to think about the concept of power. So starting from our central government, we advocated for tailor-made tax policies, but it was something that was problematic with the European Union because automatically refers that you are involving in a free labor market. So you cannot make preferential to any parts that could influence on a free, let's say, free market. And of course, it's something that has to be negotiated, and that when the central government has to actually use some power to explain what is going on in this local area. And of course, we advocated for monitoring how national legislation has an effect on community, especially vulnerable communities, kind of community development mainstreaming in concerning legislation. Of course, we advocated for direct interventionism for preventing exploitative practices, better political representation, advocacy network for all deprived communities in Croatia, because we have, unfortunately, these examples in many places also. When it comes to the local level, effective mechanisms for citizen participation. We all talk about citizens' participation, but we don't know actually what it is in practice and what are mechanisms that actually make some difference and make sense. And of course, empowering, for us, it was very important to understand that people have to be in a way empowered to make a transition from safe, low income to unsafe, higher income status. This is for them very risky situation. Also, we noticed there is a power of clusters because as an answer to these fragmented local municipalities and very separated institutions, we are highly bureaucratized country where the institutions themselves are so closed into their own sectoral boundaries that really makes it difficult to make any change. And of course, developing some mechanisms from transparency, like transparent budgeting, and something that was also important for many outside stakeholders to promote the stakeholders' pluralism. Because usually, if you are, let's say, a foundation, you come to this deprived community, you look for someone that you can work with, and usually it always are the same people. So there are no stakeholders' pluralism that, of course, doesn't contribute to the trust. And finally, understanding that the position of a victim that community perpetuates, empowering people to reconstruct local identity, giving voice to local experts and recognize their professional authority, and of course some kind of strategic plannings that are concrete, because this sense of predictability and control contributes to the sense of personal collective power. And of course, now we are living in the times when it's difficult to regain the sense of power, especially if we are we don't know what is going on. We hear, for example, for the past few months, we have been saying a difficult autumn awaits us. So it's kind of making a panic atmosphere. So of course, it's difficult for all of us to keep some kind of sense of power and control. And of course, if we put this in the perspective of the deprived community, it gets really challenging. So yeah, I will stop now here. And if, of course, you have any questions, comments, I will be happy to answer them later.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Anna, for this presentation. Very interesting, very inspiring, emotional, beautiful. Yes, dear colleagues, dear friends, please prepare your questions. You can send it in chat, or you can prepare it. And after the third presentation, we will open the discussion part. Okay. Thank you, Anna, one more time. And now I would like to introduce our third presenter, Elizabeth Walters. Elizabeth is a doctoral researcher at City University of London. Outside of academia, Elizabeth, she has experience working in several community projects, including volunteer projects, and the most recently conducting social research for a community art project in South East London. So, Elizabeth, I'm giving the floor to you and for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen. I hope everyone can see this okay. So thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, so I am Elizabeth Walters. I am a PhD researcher at City University of London, and I'm currently conducting research on how to embed community development approaches within local systems. And today I'm going to be presenting one part of my PhD to you and the emerging findings that I have found from a scoping review that I am currently conducting. So to give you a bit of background to my research, I look at community development through a way to address health inequalities. So health inequalities refer to the systematic inequalities in health between different social groups, which are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means. And there are several theories around what causes health inequalities and how best to address them. So I live in London in the UK, and in the UK, most research looks around health inequalities to be caused by structural issues. So different groups that are most likely to be affected by health inequalities are likely to have issues with income, wealth, power, environment, and their access to amenities. Now, although this is quite often referenced as the cause of health inequalities within the UK context, UK policymaking still focuses on behaviourist approaches to public health. So, for example, there are policies around stopping smoking or preventing healthy eating, rather than looking at these structural issues which could be addressed. So I'm proposing that community development can be a way to address these issues, because community development brings people together to increase sort of opportunities around them, to improve their environment, to work together, to have more sense of community cohesion and power. And these can be used to help people address these structural issues which may be causing ill health. However, community development projects are usually funded on sort of a project-to-project basis, and there isn't long-term sustainable funding. So this means that the full potential for for community development to address health inequalities can't be realised. So I'm making an argument for community development to become embedded and a mainstream way of working in order to reach its full potential. So just to give you a brief background to my PhD research, the first part of my research is a scoping review, which I'll be discussing with you today. And a scoping review brings together literature on emerging themes and evidence around one topic. So for me, it's the topic of embedded community development approaches. I'm also conducting a case study of a community development approach in East London, which was based on the Well Communities Community Development Framework. And this borough are currently trying to embed this way of working across the council. I am also conducting key informant interviews with experts in the field to find out about their experiences of embedding. But as mentioned today, I'm just going to be focusing on the scoping review and how I've been trying to find literature available on this topic. So the review questions that I have for this scoping review are mainly just basic questions around what is currently available on community development, which has become embedded. So the questions are around what type of literature is there, what are the characteristics of the community development approaches, and what sort of systems they have become embedded in. I'm also interested to see what outcomes have been reported from community development approaches which have been embedded, and what research designs and methods are being used to examine the embedding process. The search strategy which I followed for this scoping review was by the Joanna Briggs Institute guidance. And I won't go into too much detail on this now, just to save time. But the first 3 stages followed the Joanna Briggs Institute, which are sort of finding a first search strategy, and then you develop a full one, which was used across several academic databases and grey literature databases. And then finally, any documents which are included in the full review, their references are screened as well to see if there are any more references or literature within those studies which can also be included in the review. Myself and my research team, however, did decide to add a 4th stage to this study, which isn't usually used in scoping reviews. And this is contacting known experts in the field to see if they were aware of any literature which met the inclusion criteria. And the reason we decided to do this was because of the nature of how community development is conducted. We didn't think that we would find too much literature available in the academic databases or easily online within the grey literature databases, unless we really knew where to look. So we thought we would ask any other people in the field if they knew of any literature which may be useful to this topic. So when deciding whether an article or not meets the criteria, the Joanna Briggs Institute recommend looking at the participants, the concept, the context, and type of evidence to assess whether a document should be included in a review. So for my study, there wasn't a set participant or population group. So this just meant that any intervention which looked at any population group would be included, as long as it met the other criteria. For my review, there were 2 concepts. This was community development and embedding. So community development, I'm sure as we're all aware, there isn't actually a set universal definition for community development. But for this review, we were focusing on any approaches which were focusing on working with communities to empower them and enable them to identify from their collective perspective, their community assets and needs, and work out how to address any issues they are facing collectively as a community. The concept of embedding refers to the long-term adoption or normalization of the community development approach, and this had to be within a local system, which is the context. So a local system is referring to an institution or organization, such as local government, health systems, the not-for-profit and private sectors, and the community development approach had to be embedded within their way of working. This review included all types of evidence. However, the documents had to be in either English or Italian because these were the languages spoken by the research team. So this is a flow diagram of how we found the texts for this review. So the first box at the top just shows where all the sources were originally found. And once duplicates were removed, 3,950 records were screened on title and abstract, and 10% of these were double screened, meaning that they were reviewed by 2 researchers to make sure they agreed on whether or not they met the inclusion criteria. Of these, 275 were sought to screen on full text, but 23 of these could not be retrieved. So 252 of these were screened on full text. And of these, which were screened on the inclusion criteria on the previous slide, 36 were included in the review. So I'm now going to give you some of the preliminary findings which we have been finding about this review, from this review. So from the first question, which is about the nature of the literature, you can see these 3 tables, which just give you a few of the characteristics of the type of literature that we found. So the first table on the left shows that journal articles were the most frequent document type which appeared within the review. And then the next table shows frequency by publication date. So the publication date spanned over 43 years, with 3 documents not being dated at all. With each decade, the publications did become more frequent, which suggests that either more community development approaches are becoming embedded, or there is just more literature available on the topic, but more research and analysis is needed to be able to draw conclusions on this. And on the final table on the right, you can see where the documents, which country of origin they were coming from. So the United States was the most frequent country, then followed by England and India, which were both appeared the same amount. The second research question was looking at the types of approaches which were becoming embedded within a local system. So of the 36 documents screened, 42 different cases of an embedded approach were found. And the table on the right shows the project aims, and health-related outcomes were the most frequently cited reason for the project, as you can see. There were 14 different population groups described as a target population for an intervention, and the most common were rural populations, followed by women. And emerging findings are showing that community empowerment and engagement are the recurring themes in community development approaches described. If we think about this from a country context, based on the previous slide, the USA was the country with the most documents, and these were focusing on programs within the USA. And community development approaches in the USA, which have become embedded, mainly focus on community participation or co-production in services, typically either within schools or healthcare settings. In England, which was the joint second most cited country, again focusing on community development projects within England itself, approaches very similar to those of the UK, looking at the co-designing of services or having input in decisions which will be made mainly at the local government level. India was the also joint second country which was most frequent, and this was also focusing on programs in India. But interestingly, the focus in India was more around microfinance. It was mentioned in several documents that the political and financial position of India had promoted a focus on microfinancing programs for community development since the late 20th century. Now, this is an area which needs to have more research and analysis in this review itself, but we are starting to draw conclusions and ideas between different factors and how this influences the type of community development programs which we can see are becoming embedded. The third question was looking at the characteristics of the local systems. And this table here shows the categorization of the primary systems which the community development approaches were becoming embedded in. And as you can see, local government is by far the most frequently referenced system. I've used the term primary system here as nearly all documents focus on interdisciplinary working across a variety of different systems, but the primary system refers to the main system which either initiated the program or which the program operates from. The fourth question was looking at the outcomes of the community development approaches. And this is really important to build up an evidence base of if we are going to make this a mainstream way of working. Not all papers reported on the outcomes of their program, and this was for various reasons. For example, some were just descriptive papers, while others said it was too early on in the process to be able to comment on any results. But I've chosen here 2 examples of community development approaches which have become embedded and positive effects that they are having on health within their locality. So the first of these is the Hospital Albert Schweitzer program in the Arbanite Valley in Haiti, which has been running since 1956. And although this mainly focuses on community-based primary care, the hospital does have a division for community development. And this operates programs for improving water and sanitation, promoting vegetable gardens and reforestation, providing opportunities for microcredit schemes, especially for women, and promoting the production of handicrafts, and then purchasing them for resale within the hospital. This program has seen improved health services within the rural population on the whole. However, the most significant outcome is that the rates of infant and child mortality are substantially lower in the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer area compared to the rest of Haiti. And they've also significantly improved within the area of the program since the initiative started in 1956. Another example comes from the Trieste micro area program in Italy. And the city of Trieste has over 30% of the population aged 65 years or over, which has resulted in a higher risk of poor physical health and mental health, primarily due to a lack of adequate services and social exclusion. So the program was developed with several stakeholders, such as the local municipalities and the Regional Housing Association, and they worked in micro areas of 400 to 2,500 people to help them address issues which were occurring in those micro areas. Results of this program to date, and it started in 2007, have shown that the incident rate of hospital admissions for psychosis, acute respiratory infections, and cardiovascular disease has decreased by 85%, 56%, and 28% respectively since the program was introduced. Now, although here I've just given 2 examples very briefly of where community development programs have become embedded with positive outcomes, it is clear that this is having a positive effect on health, and this evidence base needs to grow if this is going to become a mainstream way of working. So my final research question was looking at what research methods have been looked at the embedding process, and only 3 documents had focused on the process of embedding. All of these included a case study, and these case studies had interviews, documentary analysis, and focus groups, which we used as research methods. When it came to analysis, 2 of these papers used thematic analysis, and 1 used the normalization process theory. So thematic analysis refers to the researcher coding either inductively as themes emerge, or deductively, based on a preset code book. And then the codes are brought together to find reoccurring themes within the data. And the normalization process theory is a set framework which is used in innovation science, which looks at the social processes which can adopt which looks at the social processes which affect whether or not an innovation becomes adopted. So these are the different ways that different studies are looking at how the process of embedding is coming about. So as I've mentioned, these very much are preliminary findings, but it is clear that there is a distinct lack of research on the process of embedding community development approaches, showing this is an area which requires more research, and this is something I'm looking at with the rest of my PhD. While not all articles focused on the implementation process, there was a lot of reference to program barriers and facilitators, which can be seen to affect the embedding process. So reoccurring themes were that community development programs should be multifaceted, focusing on several issues or developments within the community, rather than focusing on just one, and this made them more successful. There was also a strong consensus on multidisciplinary approaches involving a variety of stakeholders to maintain commitment and sustainability. Finances were often mentioned as a constraint for embedding, with several programs relying on external funds for program continuity. One paper even suggested that funding should come from multiple sources to both increase the chance of project sustainability, but additionally to diffuse tensions of power, as funding often came with conditions and expectations. Additionally, political changes, both at the local and national level, were also cited as a barrier to implementing long-term change. So as noted, these are only emerging findings, and more data analysis will be done within the next months, which will hopefully provide more in-depth results and discussion. Just to mention a few limitations of this study, possibly the biggest is that 1/3 of documents included came from contacts known to the research team. So this was the 4th stage of the search strategy, which wasn't included in the JBI guidance. And as mentioned, the reason we included this stage was because we didn't think we would find much literature on the topic. And the fact that 1/3 of our sources came from a third of the included sources came from contacts known to us does show that this is to be the case. The National Grey Literature Collection, also the way that database worked, it could only display 100 articles while over 200 were actually found in the search. Links on Eldest were broken, meaning that some references had to be excluded just because they couldn't be accessed. And not all documents could be found from the included documents reference search. So these were the documents which were found through searching the reference list of included documents. And this was mainly because a lot of these references were written before the era of the internet, so therefore they weren't easily available online. So just to conclude, this study so far has shown that community development approaches can be successfully embedded within local systems, and this is generating positive results. However, more research is needed into the embedding process to make this a mainstreamed way of working. These are just a few references which you will have seen throughout the presentation. And I would like to thank you very much for listening. And please do stay in touch. I'm particularly interested in hearing from anyone who has experience in the embedding process. But also, if you would like to hear about these findings as they emerge and as they become published, please do drop me a message. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, dear friends, our speakers, for your interesting presentations. I think that we are ready to start the discussion part. As I can see, our chat is active today, a lot of questions, and already we started to get the answers. But I think that it will be better if we will start the discussion, and if you have a question, just turn on your mic and ask it, and don't be shy. And for another participants who are not switch on your cameras and microphones, I want to encourage you to join our discussion. So if we are ready to start, anytime you're ready, just jump in and we'll start. I saw the questions from Olga, from Nara, from Charlie, so go ahead.
Do you prefer us to answer the questions verbally or in the chat?
I think that it will be great if we will ask and answer the questions verbally. Yes, that's how everyone could. Yeah. Houston.
Oh, I was going to say I had a question back for Olga. You ask who the people are in the main driving force of the local model. I'm not sure I completely understand the question. And could you elaborate on what people you're referring to?
I talk about leaders and people who can build these models, who is mobilize these models, because local models have specific, and I want to know, how do you see, who is these people who mobilize, who is first in your model?
Yeah, that's okay. Right now, the model is designed to essentially survey the business owners. So it would be at this point in time, the research is based on the ownership of the different businesses in the community. So whether that is a local ownership or a non-local ownership. And so looking at, and whether that owner and that business is philanthropic or how philanthropic they might be. So the first approach is kind of surveying and understanding the participation of the business owners in that model. That would be the people, but the outcome is the effect and the impact on the community. So that would be the residents of the community, not the business owners. So the idea that one impacts the other, but the first sort of data collecting data on the business owner, and then the second would be the resident. From a research standpoint, not a model standpoint. I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you.
And Olga, you also have one more
Yes.
question.
And we talk about local model, we talk about the global problems, and I want to ask what roles does the local model play in solving all problem between people?
Yeah, I saw that question. That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a complicated answer there, and I think the answer with any, whether it's local or non-local or whatever scale we're looking at, it's about sharing and communication. And I think, and I think that's why we're all involved in this conference today, right? Is understanding what communities are doing outside of our own, and kind of that constant learning of best practices and constant learning of what's working and what's not working. Just both equally important to know and understand, so that can be shared, with the caveat that there are not silver bullets, and just because something works well one place doesn't mean it's going to work well another place under a very different system. But the communication education component to me is the important answer to that question. And I'll let someone else answer a question. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Houston, for your answers. Inara, maybe you will proceed with your questions.
Yes, I wrote my question, but Anna asked me in the chat, but I can answer again, yes? So my question was for Anna, how you see the next steps for the development of your community. I think you can tell it verbally, yes?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to spare some time for the discussion, and thank you and Charlie for questions. Yes, about Inara, your question, I was now thinking about, because I was a part of this strategic planning, and now something strange is happening with strategic planning in Croatia. And several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we were so happy and thrilled to make strategic planning. And now all these plans, I don't know, they seem like there are actually no real, they don't tell you anything about the vision of the future. So we had very concrete dispute with our ministry. So after months of work, actually nothing happened. And I think they paid us to make something for them. Then we will sign the non-closure agreement. And then, so we were actually paid not to tell it in the public. But then again, we published a book now. So actually no one can stop us to making academic work. But of course, something is strange happening. And now when you take a look at the strategic plans that the government made for this area after we had separate ways, actually now the strategic plan actually consists of activities that would happen either way. And there are some, it's like a message, these are the things that you have on your table, like many European funds, you can take it, but you don't have to. So it's basically like this, no time frame, no resources, no institutional, let's say maybe new institutional solutions. So I don't have high hopes about strategic plannings, but I also do not have high hopes on local led development, because as I wrote, I think that these communities are so exhausted, and it is not fair from them to expect completely a local led development. Of course, it has to be kind of a primer, let's say a norm or a value, or make things, make a context in favor, so that local led development can make sense, because in this situation it doesn't make much sense. And I thought, as I wrote, maybe these two strategies that could work is the national legislation that can take into account regional inequalities, and not only in sectoral policy, but in all policies. Like, for example, when we had COVID and the COVID measures, they reflect differently in deprived communities, or other things like now my research and also some other foreign research actually show showed that in these rural communities, the expenses, living expenses are actually much higher than expected. So it's a kind of counterintuitive. And now the heating, the energy crisis, I think it will affect them much more than expected. So it makes kind of, let's say, community development mainstreaming and taking into account what national legislation, what effects does it have on regional inequalities, and making some kind of network or making, let's say, community deprivation across our country that deal with similar issues, to make kind of a networking and coalition to advocate for them much more. But there is also a political problem there. It's mostly these rural poor areas are actually led by the party that is in rule in the national level. So they don't want to, let's say, become in dispute with the national government because they're a part of the same right-wing party. So there is always, of course, some kind of political perspective to it. But I think that this could be, let's say, two powerful strategies. And then community-led development that can be, let's say, enhanced if we have these prerequisites outside fulfilled.
Thank you for so detailed response.
And also, Anna, Charlie, I saw that you already answered the question Charlie asked, but maybe briefly, you will repeat it for our audience, the brilliant answer.
Yes, you will see in the reply the composition of a national index of development in Croatian municipalities. But what I wanted to emphasize is that there was some statistical shenanigans with the index. So to make the drama of inequalities much lighter, I would say. So now you have to look for the inequalities in a second or third decimal place, and I can send you a link if you just want to get an idea about the numbers. You don't have to, you can, it's not a problem that it's on Croatia, just to see what I'm talking about. But index itself is a good tool to make, let's say, kind of a highlight on the most vulnerable communities. But outside the most vulnerable ones, we don't see the scale of inequalities in a good way. But it's a let's say, a starting point for developing policies on a national level. Now it mostly
sorry.
Yes, now it has
May I ask a question?
tax policies, that's all. Yes, sorry.
No, thank these are really fascinating presentations, and I can see the connections in many ways between them, because what it's saying to me, in somewhere like, for example, your own country, Anna, you're working within different tiers of government. So you have your local governments, your whatever, your regional, your national, and then there's the European Union, which is a tier of government and which distributes funds to disadvantaged areas. And of course, it has to work with national governments to decide what those disadvantaged areas are. So it's all about, isn't it? I mean, I'm one of those people, I go back 5 decades in community development, and I remember those, for me, wonderful days when governments and municipalities invested in community development. And then we got this terrible wave of neocon and neoliberal policies that completely destroyed a lot of the budgets of local authorities to be able to do things. And national governments had other priorities, all these sorts of things. So as community development practitioners, and when we're running community projects, we know that funding from the state is much more difficult than it's been in the past from the state, and also strategies from the state. Because what it was interesting listening to Elizabeth's one, it just made me think, just very briefly, I think the first statistical measurement in Britain of poverty was undertaken by a guy called General Booth. I think that was him, who set up the Salvation Army. Some of you may have heard of the Salvation Army. And he went around London and he had a color coding of London. He would draw some areas as red, blue, yellow, whatever color. And it would depend on how many drunks he came upon, people that were drunk, how many prostitutes, how many Irish people, So these were the indicators used in the 19th century of sort of blaming the victim. There were no serious looks at inequality or the relationship between a rich area or a poor area and the redistribution that would be necessary to really invest in community development. And I almost feel sometimes we've gone full circle and have returned to very weak indicators of actually trying to understand inequalities, and therefore the need for substantial investment in those poorer areas. And of course, many poor people don't live in designated poor areas. They're not all clustered together. This is one of the reasons I also, as with Houston, have a certain skepticism about this, about localism, because I think it's rather like asset-based community development. It's become very, very dominant in recent years. But what it's really about is self-help. You know, you're not going to get much help from governments. You've got to help yourselves to come up with your strategies. So sorry, I just it's such a stimulating range of presentations that it rather made me depressed. But I think there are ways we can get around this. I think Elizabeth was pointing to some of those, as indeed was Anna.
Can I just come in there?
Yeah, Gail.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of an interloper because I'm one of Elizabeth's PhD supervisors. But you mentioned the booth maps, and this is often my background is public health, and I've very been a passionate about community development since I was a community development worker in the 1980s. But in doing presentations, we often use the booth maps and compare them to maps of London now. And, London, compared to, is one of the wealthiest cities in the entire world. And yet the booth maps, which showed the pattern of inequalities across London, and you look at and compare those with inequalities today, and they've hardly changed. It's still concentrated in East London, with pockets of deprivation in practically every borough across London. And this is why we're so interested in community development, which has such potential, but as you identified, has been starved of funding and is considered, it's very much the marginal way of working, a very different way of working. And somehow we've got to bring it into the mainstream. I mean, it's not the answer in itself, community development. But again, linking back to some of the presentations about people's sense of power and control, agency, etc., within the very deprived communities, this is a really important part of finding solutions to health inequalities. So yeah, it's quite interesting how these rather diverse presentations, but at the same time, very much linked presentations in terms of the situation we face. So thank you.
Thank you, Gail, for joining us, our presentation, our discussion. I think we can proceed. We have a question for Elizabeth. Questions in chat, or maybe we can read it.
Yeah, so I'll actually jump in because I think that I can see Charlie's asked a question which he sort of asked again there, and I think that it's, for me, it actually links in with the question which Olga also asked, which what's the most interesting part of community development for me. And I think I got asked this quite recently by one of my research participants. Actually, they said what interests me about it most, or what am I finding which I didn't expect. And I think for me it's how political community development is, or especially from my perspective of looking at making it a mainstream way of working. As Gail has just said, it's so dependent on funding and where this funding comes from. And Charlie, before you just spoke a bit then, I was going to start talking about neoliberal politics in the UK. And I don't want to assume, but I think maybe you've got a UK background as well. Yes, so, I think definitely in the UK context, it has become very political, and especially the political situation which we're seeing in the UK at the moment, it's definitely something which I believe there should be more funding towards, because we're seeing inequalities widen, although we should be at a time where they now should be, getting smaller and smaller with the amount of medical developments that we're finding and things. People should be having a higher quality of life, but these health inequalities are actually widening. So I think that, yes, it is something which I think is very political. And to answer Charlie's question about how far back was the literature review, we didn't put any dates on the literature review, so it was whatever was available on the database. So as I said, the earliest document which I found, or which was included in the review, was from 1977. But I think that there were a few earlier than that, back to the 1960s. But most of the ones which were applicable to the review were from more recent times. And as I mentioned in the presentation, the more recent they were, the more in more recent times, more documents were being included, suggesting that there's just more literature about it, not necessarily suggesting that it is, it's suggesting that now it's becoming a more mainstreamed way of working.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I wish you good luck and success. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also had a question from Nara, right? Elizabeth.
Yes, Elizabeth, I wanted to ask, what kind of literature would you recommend for those who are just studying and getting a degree in community development? For example, I am currently studying for a master's degree and writing a dissertation, and I would to be very interested to gain more materials. Or I can write my mail.
Yes, I was going to say, if you put your email address in the chat, because we can discuss it now with everyone, but I'm sure your dissertation is something which is quite specific, so more knowing the topic will help know where to guide you. So if you put your email in the chat, I'll drop you an email and we can have a discussion.
Okay, thank you.
And also Elizabeth sent her contact, so everyone could send a message. And also I wanted to ask Ritu Manda, if you're here, please, if you're here with us, and if you're able to turn on your microphone and your video, please make it and join our discussion. Also, I want to encourage everyone to ask questions. Maybe our speakers, you have questions to your colleagues, and you have something to tell according to the presentation of your colleague. So we have maybe 5 minutes before our session will be closed. So please share your vision, share your thoughts.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay, great. So my name is Michiel Steenbeek. I work with CBM. I have a question for Houston. First of all, Houston, I thought you were very brave. You were the first speaker this afternoon, and immediately you had some reservations about local. But I think it was very good, and I do recognize part of what you said also. I think my question is short, because you're going to test the model, but can you be also brave and kind of leap forward and maybe come to a bit of a conclusion? Because would the outcome not to a large extent conclude that it depends a lot on personalities of let's say local enterprises and less local, or enterprises coming from outside? Is it not so? It depends a lot on the personality of the owner or the. So just a question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting hypothesis. I think you might be onto something there. I hadn't really thought about the personality component of the actual owner. We had been thinking more about perhaps the sector and the type of business it was, leaning towards one or the other. As we've kind of been shopping around, but the personality, sure, all right. I mean, the from a top-down business management perspective, there's going to be a culture that permeates of whether it's a culture of philanthropy or a culture of the opposite. And if it's a local business owner, it's obviously a culture of yourself, because you have a lot more control of how you engage and how you don't engage. I appreciate the question, and I don't know the answer there, but I look forward to getting back to you, because I hope we're presenting the results at the next conference. The idea of it depends, though, is what we expect. I mean, I don't think it's going to be, this is going to explain everything. I think context is going to be very, very important. Nuance is going to be very important. And so right now, it's really in the exploratory phases of that. So I look forward to telling you more. Thanks for the question. Good thought.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your question. And Houston, I think that we are at the good point when we have questions, and not every question should be answered right now. And it is good that we could close this session with the open questions and with something to think about, something to think about later. And this is the process of development we are talking about. And on behalf of World Community Development 2022 team, I want to thank everyone for this session. I want to thank our speakers, and I want to thank every participant. That was a great session, and very good questions, very good answers, and a lot of contact. This is what we are going to do during the conference. And also in chat, we send the link to our Discord channel. This is the second digital platform of our conference. And using this link, you can join the channel WCDC 2022 feedbacks. So there you can answer your questions. You can write your reviews, your impressions of each sessions. So our networking should start from this moment, and will last on the Discord channel all year long. Yes, and this is not the end of our collaboration, and this is just the beginning. And of course, the time we have the limited time for each session, but we can join Discord. We can network there, and I want to encourage you to join in half an hour to join next parallel session, and let's keep in touch. See you there, and see you in other sessions. So thank you so much, everyone. If you have something to tell, just a couple of greeting words and a couple of yes, 1 minute. We have 1 minute. So I just say thank you, everyone. Say goodbye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.